All right, so we get to get into evolution and natural selection now, and I feel like protein synthesis is what I like to call a hinge chapter, in that it kind of connects these two concepts of like cell and molecular biology with whole organism and ecosystem biology, and it helps us understand how we go from genotype to phenotype, and then natural selection and evolution help us understand how the phenotype can result in changes in populations over time. So we're going to do a little bit of history and then a little bit of understanding how Darwin came to his understanding of natural selection and evolution, and what we have that is support for today. So when we look at the objectives for this chapter, we're going to talk about Darwin, and then we're going to talk about natural and artificial selection and the support for the evolutionary theory, because it is a theory. It has been studied for over 250 years. It is something that is widely accepted and very well shown. And I will link a video in the lecture materials too that you should watch that illustrates evolution happening in bacteria that we can physically watch happening. It's awesome. So let's talk about Darwin. Okay, Darwin was an interesting individual. So he was 22 when he was hired to be a like naturalist, ship's companion, chaplain, kind of a man of many hats on the HMS Beagle. The HMS Beagle was going to go on a 5-year voyage, I think 5 years, through the southern hemisphere. And so he at that point had dabbled in many different fields. He was a not affluential, but he wasn't a poor individual. And so he had kind of considered going into seminary. He had gone to different schools. He had considered being a doctor, but he didn't like blood. Obviously can't be a doctor if you don't like blood. And so he kind of was like a little bit lost at this time and went on to the ship and started doing observations. Darwin had always been very much into fossils and animals and plants. And so as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle, he took studious notes, he drew pictures, he collected specimens, and there are several stories of times when like he couldn't be found and the ship was getting ready to leave and they had to send out people to go find him. He didn't exactly ingratiate himself with the crew at that point because they'd come find him and he'd have them haul like a fossil study. I think there was one time he found like a rhinoceros skull, like a historic rhinoceros skull, and made them all carry it back. And so, he was not really the most liked person on the ship, but what he found during this time led him to conclude that biological evolution occurs. At this point in history, it was very much within the church's realm, and Darwin was a Christian. He was someone of the Christian faith, and he kind of struggled with this. And this is a well-known thing. Darwin struggled with his religion for the rest of his life. He actually hesitated to publish his information and what he had come to based on these geological changes, these fossils, these specimens, this evidence that he had collected. He waited 20 years to publish his research because he knew that it was going to go against the current beliefs, and he knew that it was going to probably cause him to be a pariah in the church. And it did. He is buried at Westminster Abbey, and he was apologized to the church 200 years after his death. But it is something that, like, we aren't saying that evolution replaces religion. We are saying that evolution is something that has happened, and it is something that we can see happening today. And that's why it's a theory in biology. That is why it's a main concept in biology. So why do we know, or what do we see that allows us to make these theories and hypotheses? Well, one of the things that Darwin noticed, especially on the Galapagos Islands, is that there were organisms that seemed familiar, okay? For instance, these two critters here, okay? We have two reptiles in these images. These are two different iguana species, and if I said that these were reptiles and iguanas, while they look very different, I don't know that anyone would sit there and go, no, that one's, a dog. That's not how it works, right? Darwin was observing critters on the Galapagos Islands, and it's so far away. So the Galapagos Islands is this little dot here on the map. It's too far away from the mainland to have consistent influx of organisms. It's not like going to Topsail Island here off the coast where you could see a deer swimming across the channel. thousands of miles away. And so he knew that there was a very little chance that these animals were having consistent influx. There wasn't populations moving and mixing. And the species on the islands were different from the mainland forms. They were different enough in a way that allowed them to be well adapted to the environment. So on the top, you have a Galapagos marine iguana. Okay, these guys are huge, huge. They weigh like a toddler. Some of them can weigh up to 80 pounds. They are huge. They have dark skin because they're living on volcanic rock. They have shorter noses and really larger feet that aren't as spindly. They're kind of a hefty boy. They swim into the ocean and eat algae off the rocks on the ocean. That's the only way that they can get food. There is no other vegetation on these islands that they're on, not enough to support the population. But they're still an iguana. They still have the iguana shape. They still have the iguana like laying of eggs. They still are eating plant materials. Iguanas are mostly herbivores and frugivores, okay? So when you look at the tree iguana, that is an animal that is adapted to being in the trees. This island iguana, this Galapagos iguana, could not climb a tree if he wanted to. He can climb up rocks. He is a very sturdy man. But then this one is climbing trees. It's eating birds' eggs. It's eating fruit. It's eating leaves. They're in different environments. They are facing different pressures, but we do know that they have a common ancestor, and DNA analysis has even supported this more because we have better technology and understanding than what we had when Darwin was just making his physical observations. So what ended up happening is Darwin was working against some common everyday hypotheses in his time. One of them being the Lamarckian hypothesis. Now, Lamarck should not be completely discredited, but Lamarck had this idea that giraffes had short necks. As they stretched to reach their food during their lifetime, their necks got longer, and then that trait got passed on to their offspring. So this would be similar to saying, like, I don't know, I dye my hair purple, I have a baby, the baby now has purple hair. We know that that's not really how it works, right? We know that what you work towards in your own lifetime or things that you change about yourself doesn't change your offspring. What Darwin suggested instead was that reproductive success was dependent on the individual's success in the population. So if you had individuals that had natural variation, like giraffes with various neck lengths, individuals with longer necks were able to better survive or better utilize resources, and that led to babies being born with longer necks. And this is actually what we do see regularly. Fitness is all about making babies, and your genes are, living organisms are driven to pass their genes on to their offspring. And in that way, we are saying that individuals who are the ones who survive, the ones who are best at competing, the ones who get the most mates, the ones who have the best phenotypes and therefore genotypes are the ones that are going to have offspring. And that is something that we do see happening, okay? Now, there are some things about Lamarck that maybe aren't incorrect, especially if you were to research something called epigenetics. I'm not going to get into it too much, but epigenetics is this idea that your genes can be changed by your lifestyle. So things like there have been some studies on people from the Great Depression and showing that lack of food and that starvation that a lot of people went through actually changed their genes, not in a way with mutations, but by things like methylation or changing how those genes turn on and off. And it can result in future generations having a higher tendency for obesity because their bodies are getting triggered from their great-great-grandparents having to deal with starvation. And there are some other things that are there. So we're actually kind of finding that while Lamarck wasn't right, there are parts of his hypothesis that actually work within natural selection and evolution. Okay? And remember, fitness, all about making them babies. So one of the things that Darwin did when he got back to England after his trip was to look at natural selection from the perspective of the scientific method. In nature, we make observations, but we're not necessarily changing and controlling things. We don't necessarily have independent and dependent variables. We don't necessarily have that. And I want you to remember too that during this time, we did not know about DNA. We did not have the chromosomal theory of inheritance. We did not even have genetics because Mendel wasn't working on his genetics until the 1860s, and Darwin was doing his work in 1831. So we're talking like 30 years, okay? So what do we find? Well, Darwin went back home and started working through artificial selection, which is something humans have been doing for as long as agriculture has been a thing. Okay, artificial selection is human driven and can be used to support natural selection because you can control the factors. So Darwin bred pigeons. Pigeons are a fantastic example of artificial selection. Okay, there is not a chance in this world that a pigeon with a really frilly, ruffly thing like this is going to do very well in the wild. Also, pigeons are like domesticated birds that we changed and like did a thing. So listen to the pigeonology episode. I don't remember what it's called, but there's an ologies episode on pigeons and you'll learn what I'm talking about. Anyway, what Darwin did is he went and he's like, okay, look, I think if I breed these two individuals, their offspring are going to have these particular traits. And if I continue breeding individuals with those traits, I'm going to be able to make them more elaborate. I'm going to be able to make them more obvious. And he did that and he showed that. And there are some beautiful sketches. I couldn't find any really good ones that illustrated it. But we're still doing this today with pigeons. So you see that this is David McIntyre for these three birds here. That's their ancestor, common ancestry shared with the common pigeon. And now we have all these different unique ones here. Okay. People have been doing this without even thinking about it forever. The plants and things that we consume in agricultural purposes did not always exist in the way that they were. Humans chose traits that they liked and cross-pollinated those plants. They allowed those plants to grow. They cultivated those plants, which is why we have the brassica species plant that actually is the basis for cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, and kale. Those all are the same kind of plant that have been bred for these unique traits. So they're different now. They're going to be a different strain of that plant, a different cultivation of that plant. But at the end of the day, they all share a common ancestor because humans have artificially selected for those characteristics. Dog breeds, cat breeds, cows, sheep, watermelon, corn, any of the fruits you eat, all of those are examples of artificial selection. And artificial selection can back up natural selection. Okay, so what is natural selection? I know we've talked about it a little bit through the semester, but here is what it is according to Darwin. Okay, natural selection is that there are a couple steps. One, members of a population have heritable variation. So those differences that we see in physical characteristics have to be passed from parent to offspring. Okay. Populations have more offspring than resources can support. There's going to be competition for resources. There's going to be some sort of pressure. Natural selection is a pressure. Individuals with the favorable traits are going to be able to survive and reproduce and pass those traits on to those offspring. Over time, those favorable traits increase in the population and the population becomes adapted to that environment. This is what natural selection is. We have basically simplified Darwin's concepts into the idea that natural selection is a pressure that has no direction or anticipation for future needs. It is specifically driven on a current population in their situation they are in their environment that they are in. It is completely ongoing. As environments and change, adaptations need to change or species will go extinct. Okay, so natural selection and adaptation are keys in biology because this is how we see the ebb and flow of populations and how these species change over time. So here's our first check your understanding before we get into some of those supporting evidence of evolution. Make sure that you can answer these questions. Hopefully you can. And when you're ready, we'll go to the next section. Okay. We do have evidence of evolutionary change. Things like the redundancy in the genetic code, the fact that the genetic code is shared amongst all living organisms on this planet, the fact that all cells have cytoplasm, cellular membrane, and genetic material, DNA, right? There's a lot of these things that are very important. Evolution is a unifying theme in biology because it can explain a lot of the different observations in various fields of biology and can help us understand our world as a whole. We understand as scientists, as biologists, that there was a common ancestor. All living things had a common ancestor that then adapted to living in different ways of life. I really like this tree because it shows us the different domains. We have bacteria and archaea, which are going to be our prokaryotic organisms, and every branch that ends is a branch that's gone extinct. Okay. Then you have the eukaryotes, which include your plants, fungi, protostomes, so plants, fungi, and animals. Your protists are kind of put in through here. And you see, again, we have huge extinction events that are occurring in these different individual groups of organisms. Mammals, including humans, all the way down here. So when we look at the tree of life, we talk about the tree of life, it is huge. And we are trying to move into a better understanding of it. So what are some of the ways that evidence of evolution is collected and how do they work? One of the first ones is fossil evidence, okay? Fossils are great because the deeper that you go in the rock, the older the fossil is. This can show a succession of life forms from simple to more complex, but unfortunately, not everything fossilizes equally. We don't have good fossil records for everything. In fact, the majority of organisms do not actually fossilize. Bacteria, for instance, very rarely fossilize because there's not any bone, there's nothing hard. When we do find it, we know that evolution can occur from simple to more complex animals, or in the case of things like the whales, we know that whales had an ancestor that was living on land, but this is not unidirectional. So when we talk about living on land and not living in the water, we can see things moving back into the water. We can see things changing, and sometimes things don't work and species go extinct, or sometimes things don't work and we see other things occurring as a result. If you've ever seen the Arc'teryx brand, this is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is one of the first birds that was found with full-on feathers, and so it is a dinosaur, and so it does show us that birds are dinosaurs. Okay, so fossil evidence, huge, but it isn't the whole picture. So with the fossil evidence, we're going to use things like biogeographical evidence, okay? The fossil evidence can be really useful for biogeographical evidence because it can tell us where things originated from, and we can see where organisms have moved or lived across the planet as a whole. So camels are a great example of this. Camelid species, fantastic. Camels actually originated in North America, and we know that from the fossil record. Over time, some population of camels moved across the land bridge between Alaska and what's now Russia, down into Asia and Africa, and some of them moved from North America down into South America, okay? Camels are related to llamas and alpacas. But if I were to say llamas and alpacas are more related to one another, and camels, the dromedary and Bactrian camel, are more related to one another, that makes sense to us. We are seeing more common characteristics between the two camel species than we see from the llama species. But if we look at their physical characteristics, they have the same kinds of coats. They actually all live in kind of cold, dry, or hot, dry, basically harsh areas, and so they're good at handling that. African camels and Asian camels are very different in that the Bactrian camels have 2 humps, the dromedary camels have 1 hump. Bactrian camels are much larger too than the dromedary camels. I think meaner, if I'm remembering correctly. And then llamas and alpacas. Llamas are larger than alpacas. But they're still all camelids. They're still all modern members of the camel family. This is true with things like marsupials as well. So we know that marsupials are all found in Australia now. Marsupials actually, from the fossil record, arose in South America and moved to Australia across a land bridge when the continents were more close to one another. The reason that we have a marsupial in North America in the Virginia opossum is because that particular species is one of the only ones that survived when they moved north. Most of the marsupials that moved north from their original population in South America could not handle the changing temperatures. The ones in Australia were able to adapt and evolve because the temperatures stayed nice there. Australia is kind of the land that time forgot. And so we do see this kind of distribution of this biogeographical evidence where organisms are living today, and Darwin used this with the Galapagos Islands and those different iguanas, but we also know that it can be used with that fossil record, okay? We also have anatomical evidence, and this is what we use a lot because this is what we can see. Okay, there are 3 different kinds of anatomical evidence I want you to know. The first of which being your vestigial traits. Vestigial traits are evolutionary leftovers. They're things that are no longer needed. They are fully developed in one group that is related, but they are reduced or non-functional in similar groups. So this is going to be explained by a common descent or a common ancestor. So snakes once had legs. Snakes still have pelvic girdles, and some boa constrictors will have these little vestigial legs or spurs. Human wisdom teeth. Fantastic example of a vestigial trait. When we talk about wisdom teeth, most of us, our jaws are too small to actually hold the wisdom teeth, so we need to get them removed. Every semester I meet 1 or 2 students that either didn't have all of their wisdom teeth or had none of their wisdom teeth. And that is something that we do see as a result of like the change in our diets, okay? Goosebumps too. If you get a goosebump, you get goosebumps. You don't get a single goosebump. When you get goosebumps, it's because you're cold or you're scared or something is going on. Well, when a cat gets scared, it puffs itself up to make itself look better and bigger. When you get scared, you get goosebumps. Or if you get cold, if you were a bird, you would puff yourself up to trap the air. If you had fur, you would trap that air in your fur. So vestigial traits are evolutionary leftovers, okay? The second of these is homologous structures. Now, homologous structures share a common ancestor, but now we have different functions for them. So if we look at the bones, for instance, in the different vertebrate forelimbs, it doesn't matter if I'm looking at a human or a seal or a bird or a bat, the bones are the same, but how the bones form is different because of the function those bones are needed to do. So in humans, right, we have our hand and we have our radius and ulna and our humerus. Seals, they have a much denser humerus and radius and ulna because they're moving through the water or moving on land and supporting themselves on their flippers. Bats, they actually have the membrane in your fingers that would get apoptosis during development is actually spread between the fingers more, and that's how bats fly. It's fantastic. But birds don't fly the same way. Their bones are different. Their phalanges are actually, when you eat a chicken wing and you have that piece that's like the part no one likes to eat or somebody likes to eat, we're seeing these different sorts of bones there, okay? When we then talk about our last kind of evidence, it's actually a lack of evidence, so of common ancestry, I should say. So if we're looking at physical structures, not all physical structures have a common ancestor. Not all physical structures share an evolutionary relationship. We consider this convergent evolution. So for instance, insect wings are not all similar to bat wings or bird wings. They don't have the same structures. There's no bones. They don't have any of the same functionality. They're actually really, really different. They're still used for flight. Bats fly, birds fly, insects fly, but they do not fly the same way. So when we're talking about an analogous structure, we're talking about something that is not the same, but it has a similar feel or a similar functionality, which is why when we're using like analogies in class, we're using things that are helping us make connections, but it's not actually the same thing, right? When I say that in a water molecules, that the oxygen is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and a hydrogen is Kevin Hart playing tug of war, that is an analogy. It is not actually what's happening. When we see these physical structures, they are different, but they have the same function. Okay. We also have embryological evidence. So similarities are often shared early in development with individuals that have a shared ancestry. This is a chick embryo and a pig embryo, and all vertebrate embryos look similar to this at some point in development. We're going to see an eye, we're going to see these pharyngeal pouches that actually become like parts of the inner ear, the jaw, the lungs, the heart, and then we see a postanal tail. These are common traits. But again, developing an embryo is really important, and getting it right is huge to the survival of that individual. So when we talk about embryological evidence, and being conserved across time, that's really what we're talking about. We're saying, look, these are so important. It is maintained regardless of how else that organism has changed in its evolutionary pathways. And then last but not least at all, we have molecular evidence. We are relying more and more and more on this today because you can literally do molecular evidence sampling like in a lab that we have here on campus. So all living organisms have DNA, ATP, a lot of those enzymes. Remember we talked about ATP synthase in both mitochondria and chloroplasts. Those proteins, those enzymes are hugely important. In addition, though, we know that since everything shares a genetic code that codes for those same amino acids, we can look for similarities amongst that DNA. And so we can see like the number of amino acid differences compared to human cytochrome C. So this is a particular protein. We're not going to see as many differences between large vertebrates as we do between things like yeast. And that's the same thing here when we're talking about like you share 98% of your genes with the chimpanzee. Sure, you share 99.9% of your DNA with other humans. That 1%, that 2% with the chimpanzee or even 0.1% with humans is what makes us so significantly different, but it still makes us human. So we are incredibly different than chimpanzees. 2% is huge. We share a common ancestor. There's likely common ancestry there, but we share a common ancestor with all eukaryotic cells. You also share 26% of your DNA with yeast. That doesn't mean that you're a fungus. Okay, you might be a fun guy, right? This is when we're talking about molecular evidence, though. This is letting us understand more. That is just further supporting our understanding of what Darwin had suggested in the 1800s. Check your understanding. Make sure you can answer these questions, and let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.